towards a quorum.
Oh, Brian, hi. Yes, I will call you at 2 o'clock.
I did.
You did?
Straight to voicemail you sent me. I didn't take it too personal. I only cried for about a half an hour.
Huh. I'm sorry. Went to voicemail. Well, I apologize. So Will, who from the Regional Plan Committee is there?
Nikki, Eli, Brian, and then Pamela. I don't want to steal the thunder of your introduction, but newest member of staff, Pamela Son. Did I pronounce your last name right? And then Christian just stepped out, but we'll be back in a moment.
Oh, I see me. Sorry, this has been a day, or a couple of days, where the only answer is to stop everything and play Mahjong for an hour. So I'm still waiting. I do need a quorum, so I need the other Alice. What I'm using now to identify me is usually A.T. Peel, which is Alice Terrific Peel. And so then Alice Farrell is Alice. She may use Alice F. And I'm waiting for Mike and John Brabant. And they all know because but I still think we have to wait for a quorum, correct?
We should make it an official meeting.
Right. So I have an interesting meeting, I can tell you other stuff, with Ruben and Keith tomorrow, and V-Trans District 6, and
That's nice.
our two of our select board members. Do we see anybody?
We do.
Oh, there's Mike.
John and Zoe are here in person. Mike is connecting to audio.
Okay.
We'll be back in a moment.
Okay. Well, if we have 3 out of 5, we do have a quorum now. So what I will do is I will call the meeting to order at 4:04. And the first question is are there any adjustments to the agenda? Anybody requesting anything else? Hi, Mike. Okay, I'm not hearing anything. And those that aren't here lose their chance. So then we have time for public comment. And it looks like we have some public here. So if you have some comment, proceed, or we can just use this time to go through introductions. But I think most of us know each other. I'm Alice Peel from Waitsfield, and I chair this motley crew. Go ahead, Doug.
I'm Doug Greason from Waterbury, and I hope that Alice shows up every day because I'm the vice chair.
Mike?
Mike Miller. I'm also on the committee and represent Montpelier.
Okay, Bob?
I'm Bob Blodgett. I'm on the Moortown Planning Commission and doing the land use chapter in our revised town plan. So I'm here to hear the presentation today. I'll probably have to leave a little bit after that.
Awesome. Hi, Bob. And Lee, we know you. Lee?
Guessing there's a faulty or like a shaky connection because dropped out and then come back in a few times.
Okay, well, we all know Lee, correct? Will, do you know Lee?
Correct enough.
Okay, go ahead around, who's ever there in the office.
John Brabant. I'm the
Oh, you're
counselor.
there, awesome.
You can't see me?
No, not yet.
It's not
I
focused
always
on.
get this little band across the top.
Okay, I'm here, Alice.
Okay, great.
In the room, we also have Zoe Christensen, a commissioner, not a committee member.
Okay, great.
For staff, we have Nikki Sabato. I'd like to introduce Pamela Sun, our newest planner to join the team. Joined today.
Welcome.
We have Brian Voigt, and we have Eli and myself, Christian Meyer.
Okay, so we're all introduced and there is no public comment, so I will move on to approval of our minutes from September 4th minutes. And the four of us are here. I don't see the other Alice yet. Does anyone have any comments on the minutes?
I reviewed them. I thought they looked good. I'd make a motion to approve.
Okay. Anybody going to second that motion?
Second.
Okay. Anyone have any discussion or anything about the minutes? Or we can move to vote. All those in favor of approving our minutes of September 4th, raise your hands or say aye. Anyone
Aye.
opposed?
Aye.
John, how did you vote? I can't see you yet.
Aye.
Okay, great. So our minutes are approved. Next part is to begin our conversation of the land use chapter and presentation on Act 181, and that is Act 250, correct?
Correct. Yeah, it's formerly known as Bill H-687. It's the Act 250 Reform Bill or law.
Okay,
Passed
so who's going to start?
I will then hand it off to Nikki partway. So, yeah, I'm gonna, let's see, beginning, and then you just share a screen, which I should have done in the other order, right? Or is this? Lord, how do I know this? All right, share. There we go. There we go. All right. Yeah, everyone's seeing the Act 181. Yes, good.
Yes.
Okay. So Act 181 has a ton of stuff. It's so really we're focusing on, instead of trying to summarize the entire far-reaching sprawling bill, we're focusing on how it relates to the regional plan, specifically the future land use map in the regional plan. And the brief summary is that so it reforms Act 250 and the state designation program. State designation program is being renamed to the State Community Investment Program, but we'll just refer to it as designation program for simplicity's sake. And very relevant to us, Act 181 makes the regional plan more important, specifically the future land use map in the regional plan, more important than it was previously. Okay, so starting in 2027, there'll be the long-term exemptions to Act 250, and which I'll say around them will be the long-term reforms in the designation program. Up until January 1st, 2027, there will be interim Act 250 exemptions, which are already in effect. So for the future land use map, that's really going to focus on the long-term changes, and it'll be developed over the next year or so. And yeah, so it's really, the interim exemptions are very important. I think it's good for us to know what those are. But those will not be super affected by the future land use map. So what will be affected is development. So there'll be the long-term Act 250 exemptions, the designated areas. Both of those are intended to encourage development in areas where we want to encourage development. Conservation, so that was kind of the flip side of Act 181, is reforming Act 250 to basically encourage smart growth, quote unquote, by facilitating development in the areas we want it, and then facilitating conservation in the areas we want to conserve. And actually, strangely enough, slightly puzzling, as indicated by the question mark, the future land use map may not play as big of a role in conservation as it does in development. So the land use review board, which is what the natural resources board is going to be called, that will, the land use review board will identify the areas that are going to receive the highest level of conservation from Act 250. So it's going to get ahead of ourselves, but that'll be tier 3. And the future land use map will identify tier 1 areas for Act 250 exemptions. So again, we will define these. You see this beautiful flow chart. The words above it basically say what the flow chart says, whichever gets the information in your brain best. So the future land use map is informed. So the current designated areas, let's start there, determine the interim Act 250 exemptions, which, just a reminder, are already in effect now until January 1st, 2027. The current designated areas also will inform the future land use map. Trying to simplify this, it does not lend itself to simplification, but basically they current designated areas plus other areas of towns and RPCs choosing will become the designated areas under the reformed designation system. They will also be the areas that receive long-term Act 250 exemptions that will require town input or towns opting in. But basically, the regional plan future land use map is how we get to those long-term Act 250 exemptions in the designated areas starting in 2027. So the interim exemptions are based on these designated areas. So there are the 5 current designated areas, 5 types of designated areas, which will be simplified down to 2. So designated downtowns, neighborhood development areas, and growth centers. And then we have new town center and village centers. So all of these have certain exemptions associated with them. We'll get back to this later, but I do want to bring to everyone's attention the first one here. So you see the 2nd through 4th exemptions, all housing projects up to 75 to 50, all end with a little asterisk that says areas eligible for interim Act 250 exemptions do not include mapped river corridors and flood hazard areas. Notice that the first one, priority housing projects, does not have that asterisk, and that is not because we made a typo. It is because the legislation does not exclude river corridors and flood hazard areas from areas that are exempt from priority housing projects. So that's not great, but that's, I don't want to derail, again, don't want to derail the conversation, just wanted to bookmark that and come back to it. So the point is, there are these interim Act 250 exemptions until January 1st, 2027, based on existing designated areas. And then, I need to put them on. So most towns already have them. I believe 19 out of the 23 member towns, CVRPC, do have them. And then there's a easy tool online, this interim Act 250 exemption mapping tool. You can see if you're not sure what's already in your town, you can see what exemptions already exist. And one question that came up when we were trying to talk to Plainfield and distill all this information is something useful to them is, should they try to get more exemptions before 2027? And basically what that comes down to is it's the same application process that will be reformed, but that has not been, those reforms have not come into effect yet. So it's slightly laborious application process, and one of the intents of Act 181 was to make it easier. So it requires less work, less capacity from municipal staff, but expect there will be some growing pains kind of transitioning to that new system, even if it is ultimately an easier system. And then also designated areas under the current designation system, so prior to 2027, actually I should say prior to the end of 2025, which is a deadline for application, their benefits will roll over into the new designation system, and it'll be basically fast-tracked into the new designations. So there are still benefits if you want the financial incentives and or of the designation system, or to expand interim Act 250 exemptions before 2027. It is still worth applying under the current system. I'll now hand it off to Nikki for the long term.
Okay, I'll start with talking about the long-term Act 250 exemptions, and that begins after January 1st, 2027. This is a tier-based jurisdiction, so the Tier 1A and Tier 1B will be less strict than the current Act 250 rules, but towns must opt in for areas to get the Tier 1A or Tier 1B status. Tier 2 and 3 become a bit more strict. Tier 2 ultimately remains the same, but it has the new road rule. And also Tier 3 Act 250 review is still required and is still in the process of being determined by VAPTA. And the state is still confirming that.
A&R will
A&R.
do the study that will make recommendations on Tier 3.
Okay, next. So also your current designated areas will roll over, and you can add new areas on the future land use map that are not currently designated. Areas mapped in the 3 highest density land use categories will transition into designated areas and then become eligible for Tier 1A or Tier 1B. The 3 highest density land use categories automatically include current designated areas plus other areas that towns and RPCs choose. Excuse me. So the regional plan future land use map has increased importance through this new act. It becomes key to development with long-term Act 250 exemptions, also with conservation, as we kind of stated earlier, that the Land Use Review Board will define Tier 3 areas through a to-be-determined rule, and will be included on future editions of the regional plan future land use maps. The RPCs do not define these, and we're still following up. Do RPCs have any influence on this side? Also, what becomes an increased importance through this new act is the designation program reform. So the standardized 10 land use categories is, it's going to be a standard across all RPCs. With the 3 dense areas being the top 3: downtown and village centers, planned growth areas, and village areas. Future land use map, land use categories determine these Act 250 exemption tiers and also the reform designated areas. You can see it outlined there, and if you can read it over in more detail. At your leisure. For areas in top 3 land use categories to receive long-term Act 250 exemptions, towns need to opt in. Tier 1B, town provides letter of support when the RPC submits the future land use map to the Land Use Review Board for approval. And the town states if it wants Tier 1B status for the eligible areas. For Tier 1A, town applies directly to the Land Use Review Board for Tier 1A status for those eligible areas. Regional plan future land use map does need approval from the Land Use Review Board. As the final, that's, you know, as we oversee a lot of it, but they have the final say.
Yes, it needs, approval from the environmental board is called now, land use review board, but that's only for it to be eligible for use in this process. A land use plan would otherwise be in effect outside of the Act 250 process, right? And they don't have such a broad authority as to govern all of our planning now, right?
No,
It's a good question. I assume
yes.
you're right, John, but we'd have to look into it. I don't think anyone's asked the question. If you have an unimproved regional plan, so what, then what?
Yes, the regional plan does.
Does that
need to be
impact
approved.
grant eligibility? Does it? With a lot of stuff.
I think it would impact our ability to do the enhanced energy plans, therefore our ability to approve municipal plans, the municipality's ability to apply for municipal planning grants and some of those other programs, the designations. But I haven't heard anyone ask the question directly, if it's gonna be more nuanced than that.
I actually thought I understood your question a little bit differently, John, regarding whether the land use review board approves the desire of a town or the RPC to achieve one of those exemptions. So it could be that, right? So if you go back.
Well, there's that too, yeah, but I meant the overarching.
Oh, you did, okay, I thought you meant
Yeah,
specifically.
no, I know that
If
specific
there's
statement.
if there's a difference of opinion between the land use review board and the RPC that puts forward the future land use map, I don't think that invalidates the entire plan, but it might leave some outstanding questions about which areas are subject to the exemptions that
Right.
might get pursued.
And is there a tribunal above the land use review board that can appeal a decision to?
We have to look into it. It is outlined.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's slightly modified from the previous process.
We don't used to be involved in our planning process, so I'm just,
This is a new step, yeah. This is no longer is it the 23 municipalities deciding on the regional plan.
right,
Now there's a state,
right.
and the flip side is we're given more authority over our local Act 50 and designation program. So that's the give and take. It's been explained to me. Say that at the third party.
This is a really good question. We'll follow up and get back. I just want to say, having read the act recently, I think like everyone's interpretation makes more sense that there's like basically it's like, yeah, there are incentives that are not available to the RPC if the land use review board doesn't approve the regional plan, but I was gonna say they just it has to be approved, but then what would be the carrot and the stick? Like there would probably be a stick.
And is it strictly an up or down approval, or do they make suggested language changes and reviewing it, saying this is where we think it has shortcomings and we suggest this language? And then if they're doing that, how far can they go to the point where they're planning for us? Otherwise,
Right.
planning, you know,
Right.
these are things that kind of swirl in my
Absolutely, same
tiny
with us.
brain.
Yeah.
There is a 15 or 18 month, if we were to have a plan rejected, we have a 15 or 18 month curing process. What's the term? There's some term to fix the issues they pointed out while our plan remains active, right?
Okay,
I believe that. I'm pulling from some deep memories here, but
okay.
I believe that's how it's written. Does that ring any bells with you?
I don't know.
Okay, I haven't read that section.
There. Um,
I'm just noticing that B is looking to be admitted.
And as far as the appeals, Act 181 limited appeals of, Act 250 permit decisions. But I don't know if that limitation on appeals applied to regional plan rejections by the land use review board. I think that's separate, but like. It's a 171 page bill and I just
Well,
don't
we can
have
find out.
every detail that,
Yeah. We'll get back to you.
and then, oh, and one other thing that's important too, is there's a lot that, a lot of rulemaking still happening. So that is like somewhat.
Sorry,
clear-
Will, a lot of what has still happening?
Rulemaking still happening. If you look at the bill itself and then a lot of the like, concise 12-page summaries of it. There are a lot of just unanswered questions. I don't even know who
And
makes
they have
those
to
rules.
appoint the boards to the land use review board, and I heard they had 85 applicants after a second advertisement.
Well, okay. We're almost finished. It's okay, so, all right, definition process. So which areas go in which land use category on the future land use map? I think we did show you the categories. BAPA is supposed to have this methodology wrapped up that the RPCs have been contributing to by the end of 2024. So it's really, they're still defining the exact methods. RPC process is ongoing. Well, we're having consultations with towns, reviewing town plans, especially geared towards looking at future land use maps and planning, reviewing zoning constraints, and also existing state designations, and just informing you on this new reform process with the state designation process. How much discretion does CVRPC have? This is the reminder, the land use review board must approve this future land use map and the regional plan. The criteria is still to be determined. Potential conflicts we see, are there times when towns and RPCs will disagree on land use categories? How will this be resolved? And of course, your question just now, if the land use review board rejects our plan. These are questions that we have, and it's a very complex act that we've been trying to simplify for you, and I think that's the end for now. Are we?
Yeah, that also one thing to maybe add further muddy the waters. There's, I think if I'm remembering and reading correctly in the first place, what I'm now trying to remember, the land use review board can approve or reject the regional plan as a whole and specifically the future land use map. Definitely the future land use map, but it might be two separate decisions, or it might have just been shorthand in the legislation. Also, didn't want to, I figured this is already complicated enough without going like more in the weeds than we already have, but Kevin Geiger of Two Rivers Ottauquechee Regional Commission sent out a memo that maybe some of you have already seen about unanswered questions, potential inconsistencies, basically just kept like things that he's been tripping up on reading Act 181, and some of them have proposed fixes, which can be fairly simple or not. Some of them don't, and then a lot of them are just like these questions of like, okay, if these rules are being made, like what are, what do they have to get right when they're making them? So yeah, didn't want to complicate things excessively before this presentation, but I think if people are interested in that, that's definitely another thing to send around. And it's safe to say, I mean, if you're not interested, you just don't have to read it. But I'm guessing it's some people like that. So
we're also sharing a training on Act 181 this winter, so that will be available for municipalities probably, yeah, end of the year. And it will also include municipal key points, so we'll have it broken down based on Act 250 reform, the future land use map, and the state designation reform.
What
Okay.
does this actually do for municipalities? Like,
What does it do for municipalities?
what does it exactly do? I mean, I'm looking at this, numbers of tier 1 and tier 2 of what you can, you can build large numbers of houses. But it would seem to me the municipalities are still going to make the decisions on whether they want to or not. I mean, I can't imagine towns just saying, oh boy, let's put in 80 new housing units in our village centers. I mean, I'd need to say where, and what are the services, what are the costs now that the towns are going to incur? I just not seeing what this does other than developers going yippee. But if developers are going to be looking at that many units, I don't think they're going to be looking in the areas that this is saying. I mean, it also seems to me that what it's really saying is, hey, I think it's time to, and I've been saying this for a while, and some people think I'm crazy, but priority projects are like, quick, let's build this stuff because we need to. And, I was just reading our housing chapter and the number predictions and the population predictions in our housing chapter. And to me, these numbers and what's in our housing chapter are way different. And then the last thing I'm going to say is anybody noticing the conflicts here with the river corridor regulations and plans and with FEMA and special flood hazard areas? Like I'm already hearing you build in a FEMA flood hazard area and you can't get flood insurance.
Well,
So
we've had this conversation around Act 121 in particular, the Flood Safety Act, and how there does seem to be conflict with Act 181 and 121, which is the Flood Safety Act.
I mean, I see conflicts between the two. They just don't mesh to me.
I guess I would just jump in and say it's up to it's really up to the municipality to decide. And some towns are in a better position staffing wise and planning wise to take over a lot of these responsibilities, and even building in the floodplain. I know there's a lot of people don't build in the floodplain, but it's really a matter of building properly to flood codes. I just gave a tour this afternoon to a bunch of University of Pennsylvania grad students, and we were talking about resiliency and pointing out the fact that every single building in downtown Montpelier that was built after the flood regulations went into effect did not flood because they were all built to flood codes. And our new flood rules today are even stricter than they were back then. So the reason we had so many flood damages was because 95% of our downtown was built before flood codes. So it's sometimes it is the correct answer to say don't build in the floodplains, and sometimes it's okay to build in the floodplains. Just make sure you're building properly. And so, and the same with these other things. Getting out of Act 250 is a big deal because for communities that want it, it makes permits go a lot faster. We have a project, Isabel Circle, that we approved a year and a half ago. For the last year and a half, it's been going through Act 250. They could have built last year, but they have to go through Act 250, which just takes a long time and costs a lot of money. Act 250 also puts on burdens onto the developers that we don't from a local regulation standpoint. We are the compact settlement that protects the rural countryside, our downtown. So when Act 250 comes in and says, you can't build there because that's prime ag soils, and we're like, it's not a farm. It's never going to be a farm, but we have to mitigate it. And all the other responsibilities that come onto it. Now, certain things we still have to respect because it's in other things. We still can't build in wetlands with those. All those wetland rules still apply because they're outside of Act 250. But getting out of Act 250 makes a difference in our ability to develop Country Club Road site. That area is an old golf course, but it's also prime ag soils. So it's ridiculous to go through and say, we need a lot of housing. Here's an area out of the floodplain that's flat, open, has access to sewer and water, but you can't build there because it's prime ag soils. It's kind of like, seriously, where are we going to build? That is not in the floodplain, prime ag soils, steep slopes. You're going to be left with a handful of spots. So at a certain point, you've got to go through and say, this is a downtown. Put development here, because by putting development here, it's taking development pressure off of the rural countrysides. And that's what we're trying to do by getting Montpelier into one of these tier 1As. We're trying to get ourselves out. And it also gives the last point is Act 250 gives people another bite at the apple in appeals. So people can appeal these things. And there's a recent article in VT Digger that went into it. If people just, they'll appeal the zoning permit up through to the Supreme Court, they'll lose. Then they go and appeal the Act 250, lose. But the whole point is to draw it out for 5 years until the developer runs out of money. And by taking Act 250 off the table, you can't appeal that for another 3 more years. And so it's a big help. And so there are a number of reasons why a community wants, but like I said, it's optional. If the Mad River Valley's like, nope, we like having Act 250. We like having that extra set of eyes look on these projects. Great, you don't have to participate in the program. But for those of us who are in a different situation, we do want to participate in this, and it is a very big deal for the Berry cities and the Montpeliers to get access to these exemptions. So I think it'll be a big deal as it goes forward. I have no idea how this is all going to play out, but I'm very interested to see how it plays out over the long term.
Yeah, can I address a little bit of what Mike's saying, a little bit of pushback, Mike, John Braven. The benefit of Act 250 in regulating places like Montpelier and Burlington and downtowns is that those impacts are not limited to your downtowns. They have impacts downstream, like your wastewater plant that fails every time it thinks about raining, like Barry's that's been out of compliance for I don't know how long, that then gets enjoyed by the swimmers in Moortown and Waterbury, which then overflows and is enjoyed by those in Richmond. The idea behind Act 250 and the reason, and I, by the way, I don't support these changes. I'm not in the legislature, but I support some of them, but it's myopic. It's just like with the floodplain. Filling in the floodplain only shifts the floods downstream and increases the ferocity. This is not a simple like, gee, everybody was stupid 50 years ago and we're so smart now. There were reasons why there was review, both in the urban centers and in the rural communities. And I think it's unfair to just dispense of them or not also raise those issues. There's traffic, there's all sorts of stuff, and pollution, which is a concern of mine. There is habitat, the Alan Goldman farm. It's a beautiful farm on top of the hill. Yeah, it's a remnant, but it's, I don't know, Mike, how many acres is that? 350 acres, something like that. I've seen bear up there. I've seen moose up there. There's every kind of wildlife habitat. And so now that doesn't see Act 250 review. And it's under Act 250, folks, that Fish and Wildlife has any authority. Fish and Wildlife, only thing they can regulate is hunting seasons and what can and can't be hunted. They cannot regulate land use, but through Act 250 and Title 30, Section 248. Those are the only places they have any regulatory authority at all. And so when you dispense of Act 250 review, now Montpelier decided we're gonna call that Goldman Farm a growth center, which I know was talked about some years ago, if not now. All that wildlife habitat could be developed without any regulatory review. So I'm not totally accepting what you're putting out, Mike, in whole.
Alice, one thing, regarding, the potential conflicts with floodplain and river corridor, regulations, that will be somewhat, so Act 121, formerly S213, the Flood Safety Act, will, I forgot to come back to that loophole, but basically that, the Flood Safety Act will make a statewide, floodplain and river corridor permit, that will come into effect in, I believe, 2027, so right about when, the long-term Act 250 exemptions take effect. And then similarly, there's some amount of rulemaking, some is to be determined. Similarly, that it appears that there will be an option for municipalities that have the in-house administrative capacity, have the floodplain and river corridor bylaws that meet or exceed the minimum state standards. They will basically be able to, similar to the Act 250 exemptions in Act 181, be able to opt out of having that essentially redundant state review in issuing a flood hazard permit, whatever they want to call the floodplain river corridor permit. So there will be some safeguards introduced at the state level in starting 2027. However, that loophole that exists now that hopefully will be corrected in the next technical corrections bill. I'll just go back to this real quick. Sitting here, this computer. Yeah, here we go. So the first one on this list, the priority housing projects. This is where I see the biggest risk is, and so it's only until January 2027. But basically they, all the other exemptions that we see on this slide that are new to Act 181, all exclude river corridors and flood hazard areas from the Act 250 exempt areas. So basically like Act 250 can still stop developments from happening between now and 2027 in the high risk areas. For the new exemptions, however, the priority housing project, Act 250 exemption was introduced in the Home Act in 2023, and then was updated and expanded slightly in Act 181. But I guess flooding was not as much of a priority, or like front and center in people's minds at that point. So they didn't exclude river corridors and flood hazard areas from the exempt areas for priority housing projects. And basically what that comes down to is it falls on the municipalities to regulate that, and most municipalities that have the wherewithal to get a designated downtown neighborhood development area or growth center have floodplain bylaws, and some, shout out to Montpelier, have river corridor bylaws as well, but not all. So there is considerable risk there, and also priority housing projects. Yeah, it's at least 20% low income, or yeah, low income housing. And there's no cap. So you see up to 75 dwelling units, up to 50 dwelling units on the other exemptions. There's no cap on how many dwelling units are exempt from Act 250 under this interim exemption. And then the only other baked in protection is neighborhood development areas have to, at least newly designated ones, have to have floodplain and river corridor bylaws in the neighborhood development area. Now, that doesn't require those bylaws within the half-mile radius, And then designated downtowns and growth centers, there's no flood requirement there. So that I've noticed is a potentially very risky, if people sneak that in before January 1st, 2027, that could put a lot of people in harm's way. But after the Flood Safety Act's new statewide permit comes into effect at around January 1st, 2027, hopefully that should mitigate whatever risk would be introduced by these new Act 250 exemptions, at least specifically with regard to flooding. So hopefully in the long run, that's not putting a lot of people in harm's way because of that separate permit. But it might also mean that the amount of new housing we can build is severely reduced because we can't build it in the floodplain or river corridor. So the conflict is not in any way gone, but hopefully the putting people in risk will be reduced.
I have a question.
Mike,
Yes,
go ahead.
I was just gonna mention real quick that I'll be able to give some input as the year goes on to that act because I was the representative that was appointed to the Senate committee that is developing the rulemaking. Apparently in the development of that, there's a requirement that there's a community representative from a community of greater than 5,000 people. So I'm the one who's been appointed to that Senate rulemaking committee on that project. So hopefully as I learn more, I'll be able to give you guys some information on that too.
Is that for Act 181 or 121?
121, the floodplain one, the state, I don't know what I call the state takeover of the floodplain rules one.
Yeah, well, I get to call on me. You see, my question in all of these acts, 181, 121, et cetera, and A&R river corridor regulations. What I'm concerned about in Act 250 is the intent, the focus of it seems to be, and Mike has a point about the length of Act 250 hearings and the frustrations of that. But nowhere am I hearing, yeah, but we are now facing climate change. We're facing new flood hazards. FEMA is reviewing all of its 100-year categories, which, aren't really applying anymore. FEMA, Brian, remember you had said FEMA is requiring river corridor bylaws for the municipalities now in 2 years or so, something like that. And FEMA is getting very involved in this. And so is Vermont Emergency Management and the State Hazard Mitigation Program. I'm not hearing anything in Act 250 that's saying when you do development or when a municipality is looking at a development, is it also planning and building in the mitigation strategies that it needs? And exactly what we were talking about was downstream. What happens if you don't do any kind of mitigation strategies and you're affecting your downstream neighbors? What happens? Do you allow build back where housing has flooded? Are you building back where landslides have been and, would happen again? In the local hazard mitigation study we just put in, submitted, we had to answer a question of, in these flood areas, how many times has it happened to the same buildings? And that's that's a question we're looking at. I just don't see, along with the development and opening the door to the sizes of development they're talking about, a look at what flood mitigation, hazard mitigation planning should be involved in the development of the plans.
I'm raising my hand because it doesn't see, oh, there, now it's easy. There, now I'm raising my hand.
Yep, go right ahead.
Okay. I just, thinking about how this fits into the regional plan committee, what are the next steps for CVRPC as we go through this process? How will it interface with this committee? How are we going to be working with our municipalities as we think about the conception of this future land use map?
I just want to address the frustrations of the timeliness of development alongside what you just asked about what municipalities can do to address the future and land use. And that I think, again, we really need to think about what development we need. The question keeps on coming out, where do we want to develop and where do we want to conserve? Don't we want to only develop if we need to? Development is costly, it's irrevocable, and conserved land is actually very valuable. If you need more information on why it's valuable, I'm happy to find it and supply it. But I think I'm concerned that there's not enough emphasis on the type of housing that's important for development, because I've done a lot of calculations based on information from the Department of Labor, the Vermont Housing Finance Agency, and the census. And essentially any house in Vermont that's not built to be literally affordable housing units only benefits the top 10% earners in Vermont. That's a new development. And I would ask, is there any need at all to build housing that's not affordable? I would argue not. And in that case, I think that should be in our minds when we're thinking about building in floodplains, and we're thinking about what land we need to conserve and what land we need not to, because I think the value of conserved land far outweighs more housing for the top earners in our state who are not part of the housing crisis. And if we're looking for fast housing to open up, there are a lot of things that our municipalities could do and should be doing in terms of looking at short-term rental regulations, looking at things in that vein, vacant housing, cleaning up the grand list coding, which is exceptionally unclear in Vermont. So I would just implore everyone to keep those things in our minds going forward.
I would also point out that we have the second highest, we're just behind California in the second highest homeless population in the country. And there was just an announcement today that the state's going to build and outfit some emergency shelters to replace the housing voucher. And it's important that, and from the locations I've read, somebody at least is thinking about this, is that these types of shelters need to be near services for homeless people. They need to be near transportation. They need to be near where there's the possibility of jobs. So, I think I think that's something that should be looked at too. And I'm worried that this Act 250 type of build, you can build large amounts of housing in your downtown area, could affect our ability to house the homeless.
So his hand is up. It seems.
Just a quick addition that housing for, like, strictly affordable housing also needs to be nurse services as well. Because low income people also need to
Yes.
be for jobs and transportation, food, etc. So any house outside of that, any new house built outside of that context is essentially meaningless for helping the housing crisis. And I don't think that's been hammered in enough.
Right, so one thing in chat here, oh, okay.
Next hands up.
Mike? Gotta unmute Mike.
Yeah, just getting back to Christian's question of, you know, what we need from a municipal standpoint. One of the things we need on the land use is to start to understand, because some of us, like Montpelier, are in the final stages of developing our city plans for readoption. And we're going to need to classify a land use map to get for regional approval. And so I know we kind of don't have the answers, but we kind of need as much of the answers as we could get, so I can make sure that I'm putting together a plan that's going to be useful for a couple of years and not a matter of months. You know, if they change the rules. So I've got to kind of figure out exactly how to frame a land use plan, a future land use plan that is going to work for the regional approval and also for designations. So there's kind of these two pieces that are going to be floating out there, because it sounds like the top 3 tiers are eligible for one classification. You're kind of like, all right, well, what are the definitions of those? How do I define what those could be? You know, it's downtowns, village centers, growth areas. Are these the same definitions that we already exist today? Are these new definitions? How do we know, you know, how do I, you know, I mentioned to Christian today, you know, how do I classify River Street, which is like Route 302, the Barry Montpelier Road? How do I classify that? Is that a downtown? Is that a growth center? It doesn't qualify for a growth center today because it doesn't have sidewalks. But is it a growth center under the new rules? Because I don't know. It's just a question. And I think that's what we need at the local level from the Regional Planning Commission on this, is whatever information we understand on how to set up our land use plan, so we know how to get our plan approved, and also kind of be in the right place when these questions come up in 2025 and 2026 and 2027 for these designations in these programs, that we actually have a plan that answers the questions that need to be answered.
I have a question and maybe an answer. I think my question is, I'm pretty sure that sidewalks are necessary for a lot of affordable developments or developments that would help homeless people. So if an area doesn't have sidewalks, I guess I would ask, is that an appropriate place for development? Because it would exclude low-income housing.
So I think there's some definitions in there as well. You know,
Right.
where are we breaking out low income, affordable, missing middle?
Well, I guess affordable housing is, there's a definition that's, you know, 30% of the median income of the county or state.
Right, okay.
And I think that, when they're pretty standard calculations you can make to easily determine what salary would be necessary to afford a house that's 30% of the median income of Washington County or the state of Vermont. And those incomes simply can't afford new developments unless they are literally affordable. And people with those incomes can't afford cars probably, and would have to be able to access public transportation, which for which sidewalks would be very helpful. And so that, then I ask, is that a good idea for a growth center if people can't access public transportation by sidewalk?
Well, people also need, we need transportation, but it's interesting. I was in a conversation this week where people were looking at planning the Irisville, which would be our downtown village center type. It's actually the village designated area now. And they were actually talking about how great it would be to take Route 100 and the village center and bring it back to the dirt roads and the carriages. And, I mean, this was a serious discussion about, having areas where you could, return to horse and buggies going through our main area. So it was, just kind of throw that in there. And what I was going to throw in now is it looks like, to me, sounds like that we're moving towards our housing chapter. And this discussion is starting to move into discussion of the housing chapter. So what I'm going to ask right now, yes, Christian?
Oh, I'll let you finish and then I'll go.
Okay, so what I was going to ask is, are we ready to move to the housing chapter? Because there's a lot in there. Or do we have any final things to say? I don't want to cut off the Act 250 and land use discussion if there's more to contribute to it.
The only thing I would ask of planners is, what's the timeline? What's the time horizon? What's the next step in this process so that this board or this committee is aware of where we're headed?
Timeline. I would say, well, I know I'm going to be specifically working with Montpelier in the next month. So Mike, I'll be reaching out to you in terms of classifications and how we work through that for the land use, as well as I'm working on several NDAs, so it's all contributing to this. I think we should have a better understanding, and then I think we have to get through housing and alongside develop a deadline where we need to have our outline for land use ready. I mean, is it a month? Is it 2 months? How early can we have it?
Yeah, I'd like to see what VAPTA might be. I'd like to see a draft or where land use plan for them is coming, how it looks. And then I agree with you, what we're trying to do with the regional plan committee, I think, is to keep it moving along, that we are getting to review the chapters and look at them, even if they're like in draft and the planners still feel there's things to put in here, but to look at, we have to keep this moving along if we're going to get the regional plan in shape for any kind of approval.
Yes, well, we have housing and energy. We really wanted to start the conversation with land use and just inform you on this whole new reform that's happening. But it's very actively in our minds and how we're planning and moving forward with housing and energy. So the threads are evolving, and I think if we segue into housing, it might we could give you an update on that and see where the gaps are. Do you have a question, Doug?
Yeah, just one comment before we leave land use. It seems to me that we adopt smart growth practices. We have the things that Act 250 compels us to do. Where we need to be looking for is areas where we think our regional land use plan will differ from the structure that's provided at the state level. And that small part of the land use plan will probably be the most important part, because the broad strokes are there at the state level. So that's what I'm doing my broad thinking about, is where do we differ from the broad outlines that we've been given?
Yeah, I think, sorry, well, just moving forward, I think there are really like two elements that were, like to this land use chapter, and there's like the text, which, we've been talking about is where like the threads that are going throughout the whole regional plan will, be introduced, like, well, where they'll really come together, where they'll be introduced actually, and then referenced back to, throughout the regional plan, as they come up in relation to other issues in other chapters. So that is, that's kind of one half of the chapter, and that's something where, you know, we can get you a draft that's not super reliant on, say, BAFTA, releasing their like methods for, how delineating the different land use categories. And that's something we can get, staff can bring to the committee earlier, and that's something we're also like, committee, we can really want your guidance for like, what is it critical to cover in that section, and that can be more fluffy, but we want it to actually have substance. So what substance should it have? So that's input that we definitely want from you, and we're hoping that this presentation today can start. And then the land use map, we're somewhat dependent on rules being made on the method coming out from BAFTA, hopefully by the end of the year. And then there is also that question that Doug brought up of how much and in what ways will Central Vermont Regional Planning Commission's vision differ from kind of just the standardized guidance. And then also the technical assistance to municipalities, what Mike was saying, is basically like trying to give guidance about what is approvable in a town plan, what will conform and be approved and save you the trouble of having to go over and over and over again. And we will pass along any information we get and hope that it doesn't come down to, also if the land use review board, they make rules, and if those are available, like kind of the criteria by which their 85 applicants will review future land use maps, if they make that publicly available, we will definitely pass that along to you so that you can have that to refer to when creating the regional plans, future land use map, but also the municipalities, town plans, maps.
Yeah.
So we'll pass that information along, and also, yeah, as Doug said, ways that our vision will differ from standard. That is something we can all think on, and please give us any input you have on that. And then the text, the threads, what the substance of that is, what you want that to include, please send that to us and we'll get you a draft as soon as possible. For that.
Okay, anything else? Okay, shall we move into, a full dive into the housing chapter and some comments that have come back? John Brabant, did you have anything else to add?
I'm all set. Thanks, Alice.
Okay. Okay, so we move on to the housing chapter. Who will take the lead on this one?
So I guess that's gonna be me, Eli.
Yep, Eli, yep.
So yeah, I don't know where you'd like to start. I did get Doug's comments and your comments, Alice. I don't know if we want to start with those comments, if we want to start kind of with some of the things that we've discussed that have come up, talking about land use. I do know the housing targets that we have in here are not the housing targets that we're going to be using. Well, we kind of have a different guideline now that the housing needs assessment has come out. So I don't know if we want to do a dive into that. The beginning of this chapter has a bulleted list on things that we talked about when we met with you, Alice, that are things that need to be included in the chapter that may or may not be sufficient so far. So where would you like to start?
I think, why don't we start with that kind of laundry list that I had there in the beginning from our discussion and some other discussions I've had either with Ben Rose from VEM personally, or some things that we've discussed in the Public Health Task Force for the climate change. Climate
Sure.
action plan. Yeah.
Yeah,
Do you want
so,
to, do you want to share a screen with this housing
Hmm.
chapter on it? Hmm.
Um,
Somebody just has to, I guess I could do it. Just open
um,
the housing chapter draft,
yeah, and then
share
Is
the
it-
screen.
is this on the screen now?
No, they can't
you
see
need to
it.
share it.
You just
So
click on the black part.
Okay.
while we're waiting,
Yes, go ahead, Doug.
I hadn't been aware the housing needs assessment had come out.
Yes, me either. Good point.
Yes. So the housing needs assessment came out, maybe about a month ago. And the targets for Washington County ranged from a lower end of 2,500 units to 3,500 units. So that's Washington County, 25,000. What did I say? No, 25.
No,
Oh,
2,500.
sorry.
Yeah, it is.
definitely.
Yeah, statewide it's in the thousands.
Yeah.
But
Yes, sorry.
for our region, it's 2,500 to 3,500 for Washington County alone. So that doesn't include Orange, Williamstown, or Washington. So we'll need to collate, the data from those towns, to take into account for our methodology. We've been talking about and starting to work on methodology for that. But I think those housing targets are gonna be, we are beholden to the housing needs assessment, to break those targets out by municipality. So we need to do a deep dive and really think about what we want our methodology to look like. Aspects that we've talked about are capacity. I'll come back to your question, Alice, that you put in your notes, which, is how much density is too much density. Of course, we're having these conversations about conservation and housing and the balance of conservation and housing. So, these are all things that we'll need to think about. I think the types of housing, that was also something that was broken down in the housing needs assessment, that we haven't necessarily done in our chapter. We've talked about the different types of housing, but we haven't broken down the housing targets or what we should do regionally by types of housing, yet. We can share out the housing needs assessment. It's readily available.
Yeah.
Our kind of section starts on, I think, page 380 or something like that. So that's where Washington County, the breakdown for Washington County, is. And of course, we look at Orange County too, since some of our towns fall in Orange County.
You have a hand up in the room. Zoe's got her hand up.
I'm sorry, this might not even be the right time to introduce this, but before I forget, the new housing needs assessment also said that there are 4,000 plus vacant homes in Washington County, which is 2,000 more than the target for development. So another thing to not forget about.
And something you said earlier, Zoe, that we kind of had an ongoing conversation. You mentioned the idea that, well, here we have all these second homes or vacant homes or
short-term rentals.
Full-time, short-term
Yeah.
rentals, where you don't have it as a primary residence. Can part of the housing goal be identify these numbers and set in place policy to convert these vacant properties into new housing units, essentially, new full-time housing units,
Right,
without having to build anything? Right,
right.
and I think threading that, figuring out the region can be a big part of figuring out how to use language like that at the municipal level. Right,
From what I understand from state legislators, I guess that, onus is on regional planning and municipalities to do some of this identification work, because they said that a statewide overhaul of the grand list is gonna take a very long time. They're working on it, but it's gonna take a very long time. And, statewide short-term rental regulation is either gonna happen in a long time or never, so. That's my understanding at least.
And on the breakout methodology, Eli, my recollection is they're unlike a land use map where we're gonna have sort of an initial pass at this sort of collective methodology. There's no collective methodology for the housing breakouts by municipality. So this is an area where certainly this committee, we're gonna need your input and advice, and that conversation between staff and commissioners. Find something we can all live with.
Mhm. And how would we get that information? I mean, I can see there's one real estate agency here that does every month or so does put out, here are all our properties, yeah, but they also do a analysis of what types of homes, businesses, condos versus single-family homes, etc., have sold in the valley, or, in particular, so I can kind of see that. They probably use a particular real estate software that really, I'm not sure. I think it does something for, it's meant to give the real estate agencies a, here's what's selling, here's what isn't kind of leaning. But it does tell you what has sold. I don't know if, do towns add new sales, new houses to the grant list? I don't know what the tax department keeps. I have seen second homes up on the in tables on the state tax department. But
Zoe has her hand up. She might have.
how would we?
Yeah, I've gotten information from municipalities like Dover who have something upwards of 80% vacant homes. I spoke to a select board person from Dover, and they said that they actually in the end had to pay for an outside consulting firm that specializes in identifying short-term rental listings. And I think that they paid for that service by establishing a registry of short-term rental hosts in their town who paid a one-time or yearly fee of like $100, which is like hardly anything for a year. And they use that money to pay this outside consulting firm. And I believe that this would be very important, because I think I've mentioned this before, actually, lobbyists from the Vermont Short-Term Rental Agency recently established his own short-term rental platform, which advertises that you don't have to pay tax. So there are a lot of short-term rentals that aren't even necessarily in the tax system and would not show up in grand list or in taxes. So I think identifying short-term rentals is harder than ever. And as I'm not sure how many municipalities in Washington County actually have a registry established like Dover, but it's not many.
Yeah.
So I think I've been trying to encourage my town to establish a similar registry. I've just with my own research, I've seen many entire houses that are full-time short-term rentals. So anyway, I think that could be an important way to get information.
Yeah, and we don't have very much information on short-term rentals. The housing needs assessment does break down housing by seasonal housing. So it does by municipality. So you can see in there what, like,
do you know if it is seasonal in the grand list definition? Because what's exceptional about Vermont, and I've quoted the joint chief fiscal officer from the tax department, who has acknowledged that Vermont is unique in that the seasonal coding on the grand list only refers to houses which are not all 4 seasons equipped. It doesn't actually mean that there are occupied part of the year.
Okay.
Seasonal only refers to like campers or cabins with no heat. So the tax department says that Vermont has absolutely no way of knowing just how many seasonal homes or second homes there are in Vermont, even though we already know that there's an astonishingly humongous amount.
Well, they have to know somehow because the tax rates and the allotment for school systems is higher for second homes.
I'd have to look at the
No,
methodology.
it's actually lower.
It's lower.
It's lower for second homes, which is another issue.
I'd have to look at the methodology for.
Which one's lower taxes or the school system?
Second homes pay less, actually.
They have a lower property tax
Yeah.
rate assigned.
okay.
Yeah,
Why did I always think it was opposite?
That would be fair.
that would make sense, Alice.
Yeah, yeah. I play mahjong a lot. Yeah, I got you.
It was increased, but this
Yeah,
past, maybe it was increased to less first time.
It's definitely less than, unfortunately, primary homeowners. And there are a lot of discrepancies between at least the East Montpelier grand list and short-term rental listings and houses that I know to be not occupied year round. And I mean, it's really hard to find this information as an individual because it's coming through pages and pages of information. But from the little time that I was able to spend, there are so many discrepancies. It's just incredible. The grand list has, I mean, yeah, I think it would take the help of an outside consulting firm to find any accurate information on just how the houses in Washington County are being used.
before, I think it was called Air DNA. There's Airbnb and then there was Air DNA. And before they realized they could make money on this, they did have a way that you could go in and get the numbers of short-term rentals in your town, okay? So we have numbers that go back a while where we know the number of short-term rentals in Waitsfield, Fayston, and Warren. Warren having the greatest number of short-term rentals. I think Waitsfield has 248. There hasn't been a big, huge, I want to say, uproar in Waitsfield about short-term rentals. I don't know why. Warren is going with this vendor you're talking about and establishing a registry in Warren. Stowe has definitely done it. And it seems to happen when towns actually start having problems, complaints, parties, things like that. Woodstock put in some of its own restrictions. The other way, we had one that showed up on my neighborhood. And oddly, the way we wound up not allowing this particular house it was built and called a 3-bedroom home, and septic and was built for 3 bedrooms, that, he expanded everything and was advertising for 14 to 16 people. We went and enforced the DEC rules and allowances for numbers of people allowed to rent in 3-bedroom homes. So he got reduced down to, I think, 7 were allowed. And that's another way to look at it, enforcing, using septic rules and DEC permits to regulate what goes on in a designated Airbnb.
The housing needs assessment does account for, they do have data for, short-term rentals, but I don't know their methodology, so it's something that we would have to look into, but they do have that by county. And I'm sure if we reached out, we could potentially get that by municipality. But that, again, is whatever methodology they're using. And they did have it's the Vermont Housing Finance Agency that did that, but they had a consultant that came in and did it.
Are the numbers in the new housing assessment, are they higher or lower from the previous one?
Higher.
Higher, okay. So we're using those numbers. Do we know how you haven't done yet any kind of whatever would be our number broken down by town? You haven't done any of that yet?
Not formally. We've looked
Okay.
at a little bit of, what we would want to do for methodology for that. That's kind of like it's a chicken or the egg scenario where we need to kind of figure out what methodology we want to be looking at. Because that's going to determine how we allocate those housing targets.
What are some of the initial things we're looking at?
Yeah, so some of the things we were talking about looking at is school capacity. I've heard emergency services and probably social services capacity, roads, wastewater, of course, wastewater infrastructure, and then looking at population, looking at access to services, depending on the populations that we're talking about housing. So there's a lot of moving parts to take into account, but that's kind of the very basic level of what we're talking. Population growth, like if we're looking at if certain towns are growing at a faster rate than other towns, then maybe we want to accommodate the housing targets to absorb that growing population.
I'm going to jump down to what we're looking at here, cost of housing, right-sized housing. One of the things, I hear over and over, and this is in the body of the housing chapter, is if we build them, they will come. It's kind of like that baseball movie, Field of Dreams. And, I look at people that are trying to find even rentals for a small family, larger family, me and my dog, me and my cat type thing. And I was just telling one of our representative candidates that I think the housing, just to say we need to build places for all these people. Well, I think it's a more complicated issue than that. I mean, we've got, if you look at the types of jobs that need to be filled, they're service-related jobs, like cafes, restaurants, stores, etc. And they're not the kind of jobs that are going to give you the income to afford to buy a house, even a affordable house. And they don't give you the rent, the income to be able to afford what I'm seeing is ever higher rents here. And I'm sure that's got to be true throughout a number of rural communities.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true.
Yeah.
The communities, and I think, there's our household sizes are going down, so there's that. But then you have to really look at the composition of a household too, like there's, I think in the economy, we might have put it in the economy chapter about how many single parent households there are. And if you're a single parent household your cost of living is just exponentially more than a
Yes.
two-earner household. So, you know, if you have somebody who, you have the compounding factor of being a single, parent, and you're working a service job, then, you know, there's not many places out there that you're gonna be able to afford in our region. So I think we need to really marry this to the demographics,
Mhm.
to come up with some kind of picture for that type of housing, the type of housing that we need. And I don't know if I fully agree. I think that it should be that affordable housing is near services, but I think that the picture is that people are living in more rural areas that also need affordable housing that may or may not be close to those services, including transportation and all of those pieces. So I think there's kind of a, yes, let's move toward that, but I don't think we're there yet. So how can we come up with that picture in the interim of what the housing types should be?
Yeah, and to the point of service worker income not being sizable enough to be able to live where they work. And to the point of Act 250 and whether or not to exempt designated development areas, whatever you call them, I just hate this whole idea, frankly. The town of Warren could designate, maybe they have already, Sugarbush as one of these growth centers. And the last time I was involved through this place on the project review committee back in the 90s, Sugarbush was before the Act 250 Commission for a permit for their big expansion.
Mhm.
What Act 250 required of Sugarbush, and Sugarbush, I think it was more or less a light bulb going on. They didn't fight it because it made sense for them, but that they provide transportation, ensure that there's transportation available, or provide housing if they, you know, if there wasn't housing provided by them, they need to ensure from places where housing was more affordable that there was a transportation connection, and that's how we wound up with that Man River bus and
Yep.
other. That was through Evil Act 250, and yep, you know what? It slowed that project down. Yep, it probably took a year or two longer. Yep, but it saved the bear habitat in Slide Brook from becoming developed, which was the original program. And why is that? Because Fish and Wildlife was allowed real input, regulatory input. And then it caused this whole kind of concept to be put into the permit about either provide housing and or transportation connections and services to places where housing would be more affordable for their staff. So again, maybe if we're not gonna have Act 250 do it and we can do it better, we better step up to the plate. We can't say this is a get out of jail for free. We're not gonna do anything. We're exempt. And so I think we should say, okay, we need to look at what value Act 250 added. Maybe it's slower, maybe we can do it at a better rate, and maybe an improved approach. But we don't want to lose all the benefits through these exemptions that Act 250 provided to these communities, both rural and urban and in between.
I'm gonna open it to other comments other than me.
Someone's got her hand up, but I'm just gonna quickly say, Nikki and I have to run out the door because we gotta run out to Waterbury for a consultation. Just too bad, because this is the crux of what we do here. We're just digging into it.
We're nonstop.
But you still have staff at your disposal.
Oh, we'll miss you. Well, I think the items I just kind of iterated and Eli put into the housing chapter at the beginning there, I think they're pretty self-explanatory. So I'd like to start opening it up to, oh, Mike's got his hands up, which is good.
So does Zoe.
And Zoe, and I'm gonna poke Doug because I thought Doug's comments were quite good. So I see Mike, we can start there.
All right, following up on the housing types, there were two areas that I really liked the housing continuum diagram that was on page 2. I thought that was was a really nice way of kind of describing each of those pieces. The only thing I would change or consider is, it goes homeless, emergency shelter, transitional housing, affordable rental, affordable home ownership. We've been trying to, instead of using the word affordable in those, we've been using the word subsidized. And the reason we've tried to distinguish it is because we really want affordable housing across the board. So, market rentals can be affordable. A lot of Berry City has market rentals that are affordable. They may have other issues, housing quality issues, but they're generally affordable housing. So the subsidized helps to capture what's discussed below, which is these are essentially affordable because there's a subsidy attached to them in some way, whether it's the home ownership or the rental. But the missing middle, a lot of the missing middle, we're not going to get to having an affordable missing middle housing by subsidizing every single project that comes through the door. We need to come up with ways that can make affordable housing without subsidies as well. And then there's going to obviously be market rate housing that's just, built for folks that have the resources to get it. But we're really trying, certainly in our housing plan in Montpelier, we're looking at this continuum, but we try to, as I said, we don't want to, and I hate to say this, stigmatize affordable housing, because we have people who don't like affordable housing because they don't like subsidized housing. And we're like, well, there's a difference. You shouldn't dislike subsidized housing, but let's clarify that there's housing that is run by Down Street and Montpelier Housing Authority, and that's this subsidized rental or subsidized home ownership. And then there are also affordable housing that we're trying to find out how we can make market rate. So that would be one suggestion, just for us to consider. The other piece, which is also a figure that I like, was later on when it had the graphic on so it'd be page 8. All of the descriptions here: single family, condo, townhouse, multifamily, farmhouse, mobile homes, apartments, ADUs, those are all what we classify in Montpelier as dwelling units. We put things into 2 boxes, one being dwelling units, and these are all different types of dwelling units. Dwelling units have to have 5 requirements in them. So you have to have a kitchen, a bathroom, a bedroom, a living room. So there are 5 requirements that every dwelling unit must have. But you also have other types of living arrangements that are called congregate living, and they operate a little differently, and they also offer a lot of opportunities for lower income. So that's where you share one of those 5 pieces. So the classic one to easily explain it is you live in a dormitory. You have shared bathroom facilities and you have shared kitchen facilities. That's congregate living at its most extreme. But there's also a lot of ways of co-housing. That's a popular. There's a lot of senior co-housing where you may have your own property, own place, own bathroom, but you share kitchen facilities or something like that. And there are SROs, single room occupancies. There are lots of ways of doing things that are much more affordable for the extremely low income folks that really are, how do we get people out of homelessness? A lot of times this congregate living is that first step to help to make that affordable. So I wanted to put a plug in. Can we come up with another box that kind of goes into congregate living? Because I think we shouldn't forget that as an option for certainly our more urban areas. So when you were
Absolutely.
discussing housing type, that jumped out.
Yeah, I will add that in, and this is my fun with Canva. So that's how we came up with those. So I can add in congregate housing, and I'll do some research on some different congregate housing.
What's
models.
Canva?
Oh, it's a design program that you can do all kinds of fun graphics and stuff.
Oh, I see. Okay.
I think Alice mentioned before there, the build it, they will come mentality, and I just wanted to say that I did find the short-term rental graphics for the new housing report, and I think essentially if you build it, they'll build Airbnbs, which won't serve the housing prices at all. I'm shocked actually that in 2015, there were fewer than 1,000 short-term rentals found in Vermont. And as of 2023, there were more than 11,700. And Washington County, believe it or not, has far more than Chittenden County. And Washington County also has double the number of seasonal homes accounted for than Chittenden County.
Years.
Oh, yeah, right.
And Woodbury is 52% seasonal homes.
Ah,
Yeah, camps.
still, I just have to ask, why are we building more homes that do not actually get to the purpose of building more homes, which is to serve the housing crisis? We're just building more homes for wealthy people and short-term rental
Investors.
Investors, yeah, exactly, and investment companies.
And I think that's what we're trying to get at when we're talking about type of housing, to
Right.
really match the type of housing to the housing need. You know, we have the numbers for those who are experiencing homelessness. We have the housing numbers for those who are spending both 30% or more of their income on housing costs and 50% or more. So the cost burden and the severely cost burden. So we have the numbers for those, you know, types of things that can inform what types of housing I think we're talking about encouraging.
And based on the numbers, it seems to me that if we're trying to encourage those types of housing, then it doesn't make sense to do hardly any development in rural towns at all. Because of the amount of money it would cost to build any new structure that's built in a rural place that doesn't have access to transportation is not gonna get the kind of subsidies that it necessitates to build affordable housing. So if we're actually trying to build affordable housing for these target demographics and these types of housing, then we should take some rural communities off the table that don't have the infrastructure to support such housing, because otherwise we are only increasing the problem.
Yeah, I can hear that, and I think that that's gonna come out in our methodology too, when we look at capacity. And when we look at need, and of course, towns will have a say in what their, you know, like one of the first steps we've taken is reaching out to, I've only actually reached out to our bigger towns about what their housing goals are, to try to get a baseline for, you know, if there's towns that are wanting a lot more housing and have already kind of reached a number that we might land on eventually anyway, then it's kind of some of it's a moot point of, you know, assigning more housing to them. But I think, you know, asking towns and you know, if towns have done housing needs assessments of their own or anything like that, finding out, you know, what those kinds of numbers are looking like for them.
And this might sound a little out there, but I think your short-term rentals are going to find themselves suffering or changing with climate change. I mean, I'm watching this particular year with the Airbnb that is like diagonally across from me, and he did not have the occupancy he had the year before. And there was no snow, and there were floods.
Excuse me, Alice, I have to leave to go to the same meeting that Christian was headed to.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I'm looking at the time and it's 5:45. And trust me, I never go beyond 2 hours because you're not productive after 2 hours. But let me just ask about if everybody has read through the particular chapter. I mean, I really like the way it was written. I think we've given Eli some food for thought here. And we can decide how we pick this up after Eli and Nikki go back and look and work on it some more. And I think we can call it a day here. Sounds like everybody's most interested in the Act 250 and how that's going to affect land use.
And I do appreciate comments, so if anybody wants to send any more comments through, as
Yes.
you've had a chance to look at the chapter, those will be incorporated, so.
I like what Mike said about, rather than affordable subsidized housing.
Yeah.
I think that's important.
Yes.
because
Absolutely.
We're not gonna be able to build affordable housing without subsidies.
Bye, folks.
And if we get out ahead of that, see
And
that.
for some people, it's never gonna be affordable. I mean, like,
Right.
I did benefits Cliff's work before I came
Right.
here, and it's like, there's just some people who, if your livable wage is $38 an hour, that may or may not be possible, right?
Right.
For a lot of people, that's not gonna be possible. So I do like the subsidized language. It's much more specific.
But it's important, and then that kind of gets to it. I don't want to drag this on else, but what Zoe was saying, we're building houses and anticipating, because there's a housing crisis. The crisis is for folks with a low and moderate income. That's the reality. So, we should be keeping an eye on that, and to the extent there is the subsidies, the availability of subsidies doesn't match the amount of development being proposed, we're not meeting our end goals. I think I'm trying to get at what Zoe said another way, and using what Mike said, I think we need to keep a parallel tracking ongoing, maybe, I don't know how you would articulate this, or if it's possible, of subsidies. And to the extent that there is someone's proposing, 200 unit something development in Waterbury Center or something, we need to see how that tracks with subsidies and whether they're gonna take advantage of those. Otherwise, this is just, we're not curing our problems, so.
Does the Regional Planning Commission have any authority to move the needle on? I mean, I think as with most things, it's at the municipal and the state level, right, of like banning or taxing or in any way like meaningfully disincentivizing short-term rentals. Because like this, like the idea of the bill that they will come, like, is supply and demand, like if that, especially with Vermont flooding as much as it does and not being as desirable of a destination for outside climate change refugees as it was, built up to be, like in theory, if we build housing, then that will increase the supply, lower the prices of all housing, as people are not just taking like the only thing on the market and just bidding, 12 people bidding for the one available house. But if, as you're saying, like it's much more profitable to just turn that into an investment rental property, then that kind of deflates the idea of, supply and demand.
It definitely tells that, and it's been
So-
proven all over the world. It's not just a problem in Vermont, like
Right,
all over Europe.
right,
People are, it's completely destroyed the structure of renting in many cities.
right.
And we should address the problem before it
Yes.
becomes a worse problem, because it's clearly skyrocketing.
Right,
In Vermont, and all the houses in East Montpelier that are near the elementary schools are now full-time short-term rentals.
yeah,
There aren't enough incentives for people to be landlords it's so much easier to be a short-term rental owner. Especially when you don't have to pay taxes, you don't have to tell anyone, and you don't have to file commercially.
yeah.
It's not, it throws off the theory of supply and demand.
Mhm.
Short-term rentals increase the rental rates. So build more and there'll be more availability just does not work anymore. It just does not mean anything.
So is there,
It costs, just want to follow what you said. If it cost $550,000 2 years ago to build your generic 3-bedroom home, even a used home market, people are gonna look at that as a minimum if their house is comparable or better.
Mhm.
And as a case in point, in my town of Calais, there were 5 houses I'm aware of in my general neighborhood. 3 of them sold. They were advertised in the $700,000 range. I think they got talked down, but I think it was in the 6s. So I can tell you, and I know one's an attorney, You all probably know, we bought one of them. So those are the folks who were able to buy them. There was one of those houses that was for sale. The folks who owned it, they were looking to downsize. They're getting a little older. And so they Airbnb, they didn't want to wait because the house wasn't moving because people can't afford houses. Most people at that level, you know, if you're working, even two-income families. So they Airbnb'd it. It was so lucrative. People were filling their email box to the point where they said, my God, we can keep this house, Airbnb it, and build our downsize house, and we'll have a side business. It's so lucrative.
Yeah.
It covers all their expenses, it gives them profit, and it's gonna help them build a new house, which they never anticipated. So this is a problem. And so maybe in our planning effort, we would recognize that problem and provide towns some direction and ask the state, request in our plan, we need to advocate for subsidies or whatever mitigative measures we think might work to help our communities deal with this crisis.
Okay, yeah, I mean, if that's what we can do, then
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
And I mean, also, like, you know, they're bringing in the short-term rentals. I mean, I think it's fair to like 90% vilify it, but also, I mean, a lot of the economy sure does come from
Yeah.
people, but it would be better to have those people visiting and staying in inns or whatever. But
But the reason.
Yeah,
I
but what we
sell
can do
is
to
because it's
advocate.
above what people can afford.
Yeah.
But they couldn't sell it for less. It was worth that.
And it's
Definitely,
not,
you couldn't build it for that.
and it's not necessarily bringing in towards the economy because a lot of people live in Airbnbs because they can't find a place. And they like live and work in Vermont. And then the state isn't even getting as much tax as it should be from those properties. Some places probably aren't even getting, they're probably not getting any tax. Municipalities are losing out on tax because if you're an Airbnb host, you don't necessarily even have to say that you're commercial and you don't actually have to like let the town know. So it's like you're losing money every single way. It's not really good for the state. Besides the point, the short-term rental companies take a big portion of
Yeah,
of the money. So you're really just benefiting Airbnb, the corporation.
So add something to the effect of what John was saying of how, like, you know, within the RPC's like scope. You know, assuming that I guess it would be the Board of Commissioners approves that, it seems like everyone will add that, you know, what we can do, which isn't as much as we'd always like, but yeah. But
Well, it
Yeah,
provides direction when they're asked to go to legislature too, you know, they can refer to the plan, gives them authority.
there has been, it's floated around the legislature and the governor, Scott, for a while, is not just a short-term rental registry, but a full rental registry that would include Airbnb and then renters. And it's floated around Chamber of Commerce. The Vermont Chamber of Commerce promoted Airbnb registry, I think maybe 2-3 years ago. And it keeps spinning around and doesn't take hold. So, you know, I think what we should do is put this discussion about Airbnb and how it's affecting housing development, housing for people who are not Airbnb tenants. I have heard that businesses will say we need the Airbnbs because we don't have enough bed and breakfasts or motels to hotels to house everyone. So I have heard the other argument that we need them to attract more people in for business sake, especially the ski areas and stuff. So I'll just mention that. Any other comments on housing? And like Will said, definitely send everything to Eli. And what I would do also, I thought Doug had some very good comments. If, Will, if you could circulate Doug's
Yeah, sure.
to the rest of the committee here, so they can read them. His
Oh, I'll forward yours to Alice.
Oh,
She's
thank you.
honest.
So, and other than that, I think we can all go have some dinner. It was a really lively discussion, I think today on many topics. I think the Act 250 discussion and the housing actually, and land use actually was a good combination, I think. Okay, so when is our next meeting, Will?
Uh,
Go
the
back to our
first
normal discussion.
Tuesday of, remember the 5th of November. So it's Guy Fawkes Day.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, is that also election?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Oh, shit.
Is it really?
Yeah.
So we go
You should probably not do that then, huh?
to November, that's election day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Remember the 12th of November? Oh, Guy Fawkes Day, better not. That's gotta be,
Guy
Or
Fawkes
then-
Day, isn't that the, yeah.
yeah,
I don't see why we can't meet on election day. The polls won't have closed in places that matter for quite a while. And I mean, it's really entirely possible they're gonna learn anything until the following day. So I don't see why we can't meet on the 5th.
I agree. The 5th is fine with me.
Yeah, it's fine. How about, John, how about you?
It works for me, Alice. I don't know if any other folks are volunteering and help with the polls. It's
Sure.
Doug
But-
or anybody.
Maybe it'll take our mind off of worry too. So, So,
No.
okay, with that, I'm gonna put out a motion to adjourn.
I'll second
So
that,
moved.
Alice.
Okay, so
Mike seconded.
three of us, we say motion to adjourn, we're all set. And thank
Yeah,
you, all.
Brad.
Mike, thanks for getting here.
Yep.
Okay, thank you,
Thank you.
night, folks.
thanks.
Thank you.